11 Japanese destroyers moved south through the slot at 12 knots, their silhouettes dark against the black water between Guadalcanal and the surrounding islands. At their head was Teruzuki, the newest, most heavily armed destroyer in the Japanese fleet, serving as the flagship of Rear Admiral Tanaka, the man American intelligence had spent 6 months attempting to stop and failing every time. Tanaka had earned his reputation the hard way. 6 months of supply runs down the slot, delivering food, ammunition, and troops to the Guadalcanal garrison. 6 months of slipping past American air patrols, American destroyers, and American submarines. The Tokyo Express ran because Tanaka made it run, through a combination of aggressive timing, superior seamanship, and the specific quality of ruthless tactical pragmatism that turns an ordinary officer into someone an enemy command starts naming specifically in their briefing documents. Tonight was his 4th drum run in December. 11 destroyers loaded with watertight drums, filled with rice and ammunition. The plan was the same plan that had worked so many times before. Push south at speed, approach Guadalcanal at night, drop the drums offshore, let the current carry them to the starving Japanese soldiers in the jungle, and withdraw before dawn brought American dive bombers. No unloading, no exposure, no prolonged presence in waters where American aircraft would find them in the light. What Tanaka did not know was that 3 wooden boats from Tulagi were watching his formation from the darkness. Lieutenant Lester Gamble was 28 years old, 5 months into his Solomon's deployment, the commander of PT-37. Behind him, PT-40 under Lieutenant Stilly Taylor and PT-48 under Lieutenant Bill Kreiner had throttled back to idle, their Packard engines barely breathing, watching the Japanese column move through the water. 11 destroyers. One PT boat commander's math was doing what every PT boat commander's math did in the slot. You looked at the target, you looked at your boat, you did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic never came out in your favor. And you attacked anyway, because that was the job, and the job was what you were there to do. Teruzuki led the column. She was 440 feet long. She displaced 3,759 tons, fully loaded. Her Type 98 dual-purpose guns were the newest fire control system the Japanese fleet had produced, capable of tracking and engaging aircraft and surface targets with equal speed. Capable of switching between roles in the seconds that the older Japanese destroyer guns needed minutes for. 3 weeks earlier, she had helped sink 2 American destroyers and cripple a battleship in a single night battle without taking a scratch. She had a crew of 350 men. Her armor could stop the rounds from the twin 50-caliber machine guns that were the PT boat's primary weapon, without those rounds noticeably affecting anything she was doing. Gamble's boat was 77 feet of plywood and mahogany, 40 tons fully loaded, 3 Packard engines that produced a sound like something between a large aircraft and machinery, in distress when pushed past 30 knots, 4 Mark 8 torpedoes. The fuel in his tanks was 3,000 gallons of 100-octane aviation gasoline in tanks that ran the length of the hull on both sides. He knew, in the way that all PT boat crews in the slot knew things they did not discuss, because discussing them served no purpose, that a single Japanese 25mm round entering his hull near those tanks would resolve most questions about what happened next within approximately 1 second. The Mark 8 torpedo that Gamble's tubes carried was also a more complicated relationship than its specifications suggested. It was supposed to run at 36 knots to a maximum range of 16,000 yards, maintaining a depth of 10 feet below the surface. In practice, the depth control failed with sufficient regularity that the formal casualty assessment for Mark 8 performance in the Solomons documented a 60% failure rate in combat. 3 torpedoes in 5 in the water that PT-37 was about to fire them into would statistically fail to detonate against their target. The other 2 might or might not run straight, might or might not arm, might or might not hit the ship rather than passing under it, because the depth control had malfunctioned in the wrong direction. This was the weapon on the boat, against the column moving south through the slot, and Gamble watched it through binoculars and throttled very slowly toward it. He needed to close to under 1,000 yards for any kind of reliable shot. Under 1,000 yards meant inside the range of every gun on Teruzuki. A single searchlight, finding PT-37 at that range with those guns trained on her, would end the engagement in the time it took the Japanese gun crews to fire their first salvo. The PT boat that started the run at 1,000 yards was already inside the kill zone before the first torpedo was in the water. This was understood. The men on PT-37 understood it the way men understand things that they have calculated completely and accepted completely before the thing begins, because the alternative to accepting it was staying at Tulagi and watching the Tokyo Express deliver another load of supplies to soldiers who would use those supplies to kill Marines. At approximately 2,300 yards, Gamble reduced speed to 18 knots. The Packard engines dropped from their combat shout to something that still qualified as loud, but that was less likely to alert Japanese lookouts scanning the water for exactly the kind of phosphorescent wake that a PT boat pushing through tropical water at full speed produced. Behind him, Taylor and Kreiner matched his speed, 3 boats in line, moving toward the Japanese column at 18 knots in total darkness. The night was ideal for what they were doing in the specific way that the Solomons sometimes provided. No moon, cloud cover across the stars, the water relatively calm. Gamble could see Teruzuki's silhouette clearly enough to count the forward gun turrets and identify the bridge superstructure. He could not see the Japanese lookouts on that bridge who might or might not be looking in his direction at this specific moment. He was operating on the probability that he was dark enough and quiet enough to close to firing range before anyone on the Japanese destroyer saw him, while knowing that the probability was not certainty, and that the moment certainty resolved itself one way or the other would be the moment when either his torpedoes were already in the water, or Teruzuki's guns were already firing. At 1,200 yards, he checked his angles. The PT boat's torpedo tubes were fixed, mounted on either side of the hull, angled 15 degrees outward from the center line. You did not aim a torpedo on a PT boat. You aimed the entire boat, pointing the bow at where the target would be in the 60 seconds the torpedo needed to cover the distance, accounting for the target's speed and course by calculating the intersection ahead of where it was right now. The calculation was done by eye, and by experience, and by a stopwatch, and by the specific feel for geometry that the men who survived doing this multiple times in the slot developed over weeks of watching how the math resolved itself in the dark. Gamble turned PT-37 30 degrees to port, lining up his angle. He watched Teruzuki cross his bowline. He put his thumb on the firing button for tubes 1 and 2. He pressed it. Twin blasts of compressed air. 2 dull thumps as each 3,000-pound torpedo hit the water. PT-37 shuddered as 12,000 pounds of weapons left the boat in 2 seconds. The torpedoes vanished into the darkness without leaving the phosphorescent wake that a depth control failure would have produced. Gamble did not wait. He fired tubes 3 and 4 immediately, and then turned the wheel hard to starboard and shoved the throttles to their stops. The Packard engines went from 18 knots to 41 in the time it takes to describe it. The boat lifted onto its planing surface and ran. Behind him, Taylor on PT-40 and Kreiner on PT-48 were firing their own torpedoes at different ships in the column. 12 torpedoes total in the water, closing on 3 different targets in the Japanese formation at 36 knots each. The Japanese had not reacted. No searchlights, no gun flashes, no alarm signals. Tanaka's lookouts had been scanning for the phosphorescent wakes that a high-speed PT boat approach would have produced and had found nothing, because Gamble had come in slow enough to deny them that signature. The 12 torpedoes were running toward their targets in complete silence while the Japanese destroyers continued south at 12 knots, with their lookouts still scanning an empty sea. 60 seconds is not a long time. On PT-37, running at full throttle and accelerating, putting distance between the boat and whatever was about to happen, 60 seconds was enough time to cover approximately a mile of dark water. Gamble's crew was silent in the way that men are silent when they have done everything they can do and are now waiting for the universe to decide whether it was enough. At precisely 10:47 in the evening, the first torpedo from PT-37 struck Teruzuki below the waterline on the port side aft, in the area of the after engine room. The explosion column rose 200 feet into the air. The light was visible from Henderson Field, 20 miles away. Gamble could see individual Japanese sailors on Teruzuki's deck in the light of the fireball, men he had been invisible to 4 seconds earlier, now suddenly illuminated by the consequences of the weapon he had pointed at their ship. The destroyer's stern lifted out of the water and twisted as the blast shock wave transmitted through the hull, and the aft engine room became a space of fire and collapsing bulkheads and the secondary ignition of the fuel tanks that had ruptured. The blast shattered the after engine room completely. The port propeller shaft broke off. The rudder mounting tore free. Oil that had been feeding the compound water tube boilers ignited and spread across the water surface around the stern, turning the ocean behind Teruzuki into a lake of orange fire. The destroyer's sophisticated fire control system, which had tracked and destroyed American warships 3 weeks earlier without difficulty, went offline when the explosion's shock wave overloaded the fire control circuits. Teruzuki's forward guns opened fire, not at the PT boats, which the chaos of the explosion had made impossible to locate, at empty ocean in random directions, because the fire control system that would have told the guns where to aim was no longer telling them anything. Searchlights swept the water in long arcs, looking for the wooden boats that had done this. One beam passed 50 yards ahead of PT-37 in the darkness. Gamble felt his heart produce a response to this that he later described only by saying, "The beam missed them." The beam kept moving. It found nothing. Tanaka himself was on Teruzuki's bridge when the torpedo hit. The explosion threw him across the compartment. His head struck a metal stanchion, and he went down unconscious, bleeding from a gash on his forehead, while his staff officers scrambled to reach him in the darkness and the fire and the noise of the Japanese formation's defensive guns firing in every direction. The damage reports that came in through the surviving communication channels were unambiguous. The after engine room was destroyed and flooding. The port propeller shaft was gone. The rudder was gone. The fuel tanks feeding 3 of the ship's boilers had ruptured and were burning. Teruzuki was dead in the water. No propulsion, no steering. 440 feet of flagship sitting in the middle of Iron Bottom Sound, while the fire spread forward toward her depth charge magazines. The adjacent destroyer Naganami maneuvered alongside in the darkness to begin the transfer of personnel. In any normal tactical calculation, stopping a destroyer in an area where PT boats had just conducted a successful attack was inadvisable. Tanaka was not in a condition to provide tactical calculations. His staff made the decision that the admiral could not be left on a burning ship that might explode at any moment. Naganami came alongside, and the transfer began. 57 people were transferred from Teruzuki to Naganami in approximately 3 minutes of carefully managed chaos. Tanaka was carried across unconscious. Staff officers followed, communications specialists, the people whose survival was necessary for the continued command of Destroyer Squadron 2. A Navy surgeon on Naganami was checking Tanaka's pupils and pulse before the transfer was complete, looking for signs of skull fracture or bleeding that the head wound might have produced. The remaining crew of Teruzuki stayed with their ship and fought the fires. While Naganami was transferring Teruzuki's personnel and the rest of the Japanese formation was circling the burning flagship in the specific tactical confusion that a crippled lead ship creates in a convoy formation organized around that ship's command authority. 2 more PT boats were coming south from their patrol position near Savo Island. PT-44 under Lieutenant Frank Freeland and PT-110 under Lieutenant Charlie Tilden had been patrolling the northern approaches when they saw the light from the Teruzuki explosion from miles away. They had heard Gamble's attack report on the radio. They knew the Japanese formation was disrupted and at least 1 destroyer was burning. They were running south with 8 fresh torpedoes between them and the specific aggressive intent that PT boat commanders in the Solomons developed when they had weapons and a target, and the tactical situation told them this was the moment. Freeland arrived to find 7 Japanese destroyers circling the burning Teruzuki, while 2 more moved slowly south toward positions where dropped supply drums might need to be recovered. The flagship was lit up like a navigation beacon, orange flames climbing 100 feet into the night sky, smoke visible for miles. Every Japanese sailor in the formation was watching their flagship burn and managing the defensive and rescue tasks that a burning flagship imposes on every adjacent ship. Nobody was watching the northern approach to the burning ship. Freeland chose Naganami as his target, not the already burning Teruzuki. Naganami was now the command ship, the vessel that had taken Tanaka aboard, the effective new flagship of Destroyer Squadron 2. Sinking it would force another command transfer, another period of disrupted decision-making, another interval during which the Japanese formation could not respond coherently to whatever developed next. At 1,400 yards, Freeland fired 2 torpedoes. PT-110 fired 2 more at a different destroyer in the formation. Japanese lookouts spotted the phosphorescent wakes from T-44's torpedoes in the water this time. The searchlights on Naganami found PT-44 and held it. The forward guns opened fire, 5-inch high explosive shells. The first salvo landed 100 yards short, water columns erupting around the boat. The second salvo landed 50 yards away, close enough that shrapnel from the shell's impact with the water rattled against PT-44's wooden hull like thrown gravel. Freeland was already at full throttle, zigzagging, putting distance between his boat and the Japanese guns with every second. PT-110 was running north beside him. Both boats were taking fire, but neither was hit as the range opened and the Japanese searchlight lost them in the spray from their own wake. The torpedoes from the second attack missed. Both of Freeland's ran under Naganami without detonating, the depth control set too deep for the target's draft. One of PT-110's veered left. The fourth broached and broke the surface, leaving a white wake that a Japanese destroyer spotted and turned to comb, the torpedo passing harmlessly down the destroyer's starboard side. But the second attack had accomplished something that the missed torpedoes didn't capture in the box score. It had forced the Japanese destroyers to stop their rescue operations and defend themselves for 10 minutes. 10 minutes during which Teruzuki's fires spread forward unchecked, because the destroyers that might have provided additional fire suppression support were maneuvering defensively instead. 10 minutes that the fire used to work its way toward the spaces where the damage was worst. On Teruzuki's bridge, Commander Orita was making the calculation that cannot be deferred once it reaches its specific point. The damage reports had moved past bad into the category that has only one answer. The after engine room was completely flooded. The port propeller shaft was broken off, and pieces of it had punched additional holes in the hull. Water was coming in faster than the pumps could remove it. The fire had moved into the areas adjacent to the after magazines. 72 Type 95 depth charges sat in the stern, each packed with 300 pounds of explosive. The fire was still approximately 15 minutes from reaching them. 15 minutes was not long enough to do what could not be done. Orita ordered the scuttling valves opened. Kingston valves in the machinery spaces controlled flooding. The sea admitted deliberately to take the ship on known terms, rather than waiting for the depth charges to settle the question on their own terms. This way the crew could evacuate safely before the end came, in whatever form it was going to come. Sailors began abandoning ship. Some transferred to Arashi, which had moved in to assist from the port side. Others launched boats toward Guadalcanal 3 miles to the south. 197 men transferred to other destroyers. 156 began rowing for Guadalcanal, preferring American captivity to burning at sea on a ship that was becoming a floating bomb by the minute. 9 men were already dead, killed in the initial explosion or trapped in the flooded spaces before they could get out. By midnight, Teruzuki was deserted and settling by the stern, her bow rising slowly as the scuttling valves did their work. The fires burned without opposition through empty compartments, spreading forward through machinery spaces that no living hands were now managing. Tanaka regained consciousness on Naganami's bridge at 12:17 in the morning. The surgeon's assessment was brief: concussion, possible skull fracture, required hospital ship treatment immediately. Tanaka asked about Teruzuki. The surgeon paused. Then he pointed off the starboard side. Tanaka looked at his flagship, 440 feet of destroyer with its bow in the air and its stern underwater, burning from the after turrets forward, flames climbing into the night sky above Iron Bottom's Sound. At 4:40 in the morning of December 12th, the fire reached Teruzuki's depth charge magazines. 72 Type 95 depth charges detonated simultaneously. The explosion was visible from Henderson Field 20 miles away. An orange fireball that turned the night into day for 3 seconds and then resolved into a column of smoke and debris that rose higher than anyone on the surrounding ships could see the top of. The shockwave hit Naganami hard enough to knock men off their feet. Arashi was thrown sideways by the pressure wave traveling across the water. Pieces of Teruzuki's hull plating landed on Guadalcanal's beach. One piece was found embedded in a tree trunk 300 yards inland. The bow section remained intact for 17 seconds and then rolled to port and slid beneath the surface. 3,759 tons of Japanese destroyer, 440 feet, gone in under a minute from the moment the depth charges went. Tanaka watched from Naganami's bridge, his flagship, the ship he had chosen because it was the most capable destroyer in the Japanese fleet. The ship whose fire control system had destroyed American warships 3 weeks earlier without being scratched. Destroyed by torpedoes launched from a 77-foot wooden boat. The immediate strategic consequences were significant and specific. The Tokyo Express that had been running continuously for 6 months did not stop. Tanaka's replacement, Rear Admiral Kimura Masatomi, continued the supply runs through January and into February. But the runs became more cautious. Ships moved faster. They stayed farther offshore. They dropped fewer drums. The efficiency of the supply operation declined by enough that the Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal received approximately 20% less in January than they had received in December. In a garrison already operating on the margins of what the human body can sustain in combat conditions, 20% less is the difference between holding and not holding. The Tokyo Express continued. It continued until February 1st, 1943, when Japan completed the evacuation of Guadalcanal in an operation the Imperial General Staff called a strategic withdrawal. Everyone who had watched what happened on the island over the preceding 6 months understood what it actually was. Teruzuki was an Akisuki-class destroyer, one of only 2 that had been completed by December 1942. Each Akisuki cost the equivalent of approximately 3 conventional destroyers to build. Each required the specialized manufacturing capacity and skilled workers that Japan was simultaneously demanding for aircraft, submarines, and the ongoing capital ship program. Replacing Teruzuki in the production queue would take a minimum of 18 months. The Imperial Japanese Navy had lost a warship it could not afford to lose, to a weapon it had not adequately planned for, launched from a boat that the calculation made almost impossible to justify. Tanaka never held another sea command. He was reassigned to Burma for the rest of the war, coordinating between naval and ground forces in a theater that was important, and that was not the thing he had spent his career becoming exceptional at. He wrote in his diary about the frustration. He was not a man who expressed self-pity in private writing, and the diary does not read as self-pity. It reads as a precise professional assessment by a man who understood that one torpedo hit from a plywood boat had ended a chapter of his career that no subsequent assignment would reopen. Tokyo's reasoning was consistent with the institutional logic of a navy that assigned prestige to its ships. Losing a flagship to PT boats was an outcome the command structure processed as a failure of command judgment rather than as the specific result of what happens when a skilled and aggressive young officer fires 4 torpedoes in the dark and one of them finds the right place on the right ship at the right moment. The 60% failure rate of the Mark 8 torpedo meant that Gamble's attack could have produced 3 hits, 2 hits, or none. He fired 4 torpedoes and one of them connected. The specific mathematics of that success were within the normal range of the tactical outcomes the engagement profile produced. Tanaka's career ended anyway. PT-37 survived the engagement of December 11th without damage. She continued operating in the Solomons for 7 more weeks. On February 1st, 1943, she was on patrol north of Guadalcanal, in the same waters where she had sunk Teruzuki. A Japanese destroyer spotted her at dawn and opened fire at 3,000 yards. The first salvo missed. The second salvo landed directly on the boat. 5-inch shells punching through mahogany, detonating inside the engine compartment. PT-37 exploded and sank in under 2 minutes. The 3,000 gallons of 100-octane aviation gasoline and the engine compartment's machinery made the explosion as comprehensive as that kind of fire and force can make an explosion. Gamble and his crew survived. They were picked up by another PT boat before the sun was fully up. The boat that had killed the largest warship ever sunk by a PT boat in the Pacific War was gone. destroyed by the same type of ship it had hunted, in the same waters where it had done the hunting. Gamble returned to the United States in 1945. He received the Navy Cross. He did not, in the years that followed, discuss the December 11th engagement in terms that suggested he found the formal recognition an adequate description of what had happened. When asked about sinking Teruzuki, he credited his crew, credited the other two boats, credited luck. He said the torpedo ran straight and hit something important, and the rest followed from that. He said most of the time torpedoes did not run straight. He said that night was not most of the time. He died in 1993. His obituary mentioned the Navy Cross. It mentioned Guadalcanal. It did not describe what it had felt like to close to 1,000 yards of an Akisuki-class destroyer at night in a plywood boat with 3,000 gallons of aviation fuel in the hull, in waters where 3 other PT boats had been sunk in the preceding 2 months, doing the same thing for the same reasons with worse results. On July 10, 2025, the research vessel Nautilus, operating for the Ocean Exploration Trust, located the wreck of Teruzuki at 2,600 feet in Iron Bottom Sound. The bow section lay separate from the stern. The hull plates on the after section were twisted in the specific pattern that the depth charge magazine explosion would have produced. The forward gun turrets were still pointed skyward, aimed at aircraft that had not existed for 80 years. The depth charges that had finished the ship were still visible on the after section, rusted but structurally intact, marking the place where the end had arrived. The discovery confirmed what American and Japanese records had documented across 8 decades. The arithmetic that said a 77-foot wooden boat could kill a 440-foot destroyer had been true once, in the dark, on December 11, 1942, at a range of less than 1,000 yards, by a man who pressed a button and then turned the wheel hard and pushed the throttles to their stops. The wreck lies at 2,600 feet. The wood of the PT boat is gone. The steel of the destroyer is still there, on the bottom of the Sound, in the place where Gamble's math resolved in his favor, on a night when most of the time the math did not resolve that way. Did anyone in your family serve on PT boats or in the Solomon Islands campaign? Drop their name in the comments. Let's make sure they are remembered.